In June 2018, the Pacific held its first webinar as part of the prestigious European Development Days series of global events. This year, the theme was Women and Girls at the Forefront of Sustainable Development: Protect, Empower, Invest. And under this theme, the Pacific's first webinar was about the hidden face of paradise, transforming social norms to end violence in the Pacific. Violence against women and girls is a central barrier to gender equality and a cause of widespread violation of human rights across the Pacific. The webinar outlines how transforming the harmful social norms that drive violence against women and girls is crucial to reducing violence and achieving gender equality in the long term. Addressing social norms is a key component of the new program, the Pacific Partnership to End Violence Against Women and Girls.
The hidden face of paradise, transforming social norms to end violence in the Pacific. It's really with a great pleasure to be with you today. I'm very happy to open this event with you in the Pacific. Now, what we want to do today is try to give and share views on the specific context, in the specific context of the EDDs, and we would like to learn more from your experience about how to address negative social norms that spur the occurrence of gender violence, specifically in the Pacific. Thank you again for participating, and now the floor is yours.
Thank you very much to Director Jean-Louis Ville for that very warm welcome from Brussels. And now, welcome to the Pacific. Golden beaches, deep blue tropical ocean, famously friendly people, and twice the global average for domestic violence.
Let me tell you a story about a woman called Mellie from Tonga. 20 years ago, she married the love of her life. They had been dating for about 2 years. Now at the age of 42, she has 7 children with Sione, the eldest being 19 and the youngest being 6 years old. She has also had 2 miscarriages in between having the other children. Mellie recalls the very first time Sione was violent with her. She remembers it very well. She said that they had only been married for less than 3 months when Sione pushed her head against the wall with one hand and backslapped her face with the other. Mellie recalls being absolutely terrified, shocked and confused. The man whom she had just given her whole heart to had just turned into this ugly stranger. Sione quickly apologized. He consoled her the whole night while she wept. There was some redness around Mellie's face the next morning as she looked into the mirror. Sione decided that she would stay in the bedroom for about 2 days until the redness went down. He told everyone else that she was sick in bed. Mellie accepted to follow the plan. She believed in his apology. She believed it would never ever happen again. As a result, Mellie didn't tell anyone what had happened, not a single person. The truth is, Mellie told us that the violence did continue. Over the last 20 years, she has endured physical, sexual, and mental abuse at the hands of the man she fell in love with those many years ago. Mellie cannot remember how many times she has asked for help from family, from friends, from members of her church, and even the local police. She also cannot remember the countless many times he has apologized and she has accepted and forgiven him, hanging on to a thin string of hope that he will never ever do it again. But this is what Mellie does remember. She remembers when she first had the courage to tell her family about the abuse she was suffering. She was quickly advised by her mother and grandmother to go back, to be the good Tongan wife and to be the good Tongan mother that she was raised to be, and to put up with it. She remembers when she first went to the local police station. She was pregnant with her 3rd child. She had just had a miscarriage the year before. The police officer who received her was quick to counsel her. He didn't take a report. But what he did do was tell Mellie how well he knew Sione, and that he knew that this was uncharacteristic of Sione. He advised Mellie to return home and that he would go and see Sione later that day and sort things out. Mellie also remembers telling the priest of her church. The priest later visited Sione and Mellie at Sione's family home. The priest prayed with them, and he also reminded them about the sacrament of marriage. He then left. Later that evening, Sione verbally abused Mellie for bringing shame to the family, the fact that the priest had come to their home over such a trivial matter. What Mellie also regretfully remembers is the many years of tears and the living in fear that her children have suffered over the years. The first time Mellie walked through the doors of the Women and Children Crisis Centre was a year ago. This is 19 years after the first time she was physically abused by her husband, Sione. But this is not an isolated story. This is a story that resonates with survivors like Mellie across Tonga. The biggest obstacle we are facing in Tonga in terms of gender-based violence is to do with the negative attitudes, belief systems, and behaviours of individuals, of family members, of community, of institutions who continue to put women and girls in their place. The way we raise our daughters, that they are to be humble and to be respectfully timid, to the way we raise our sons, to take on the power and to be in control. If we don't shift these normalities, if we don't shift the way we practice and the way we address and the way we approach gender-based violence in Tonga and the status of women, women like Mellie will continue to suffer abuse for years to come.
A big thank you again to Offa for that deep insight into what violence against women looks like in the Pacific. That was Offa Gutenbiel Liki, the director of the Women and Children Crisis Centre in Tonga. And Offa is, of course, just one of our esteemed speakers for this evening. Let me now introduce you to who we have here in Suva in the order in which they'll be speaking. Firstly, we have Shamima Ali, who's been an activist for over 35 years. She is the coordinator of the Fiji Women's Crisis Centre based here in Suva and has extensive regional experience. To my right here, we have Chope Tarai, a teaching assistant in ethics and governance at the University of the South Pacific, who engages in unpacking masculinities in the Pacific. And on my far right, we have Reverend Sarema Loma Loma, who's the Community Engagement Coordinator for the Anglican Diocese of Polynesia. She works to end violence from a faith-based perspective. Off-site, we'll also be joined by Anne Kausu, the Principal Women's Development Officer at the Ministry for Women, Youth and Social Affairs in Kiribati. All these speakers are coming to you from the three subregions of the Pacific Islands, Melanesia, Polynesia, and Micronesia, forming an interconnected sea of islands, our Pacific Ocean, which covers over 1/3 of the Earth's surface. All of us here in this room and those of us who are joining as voices on video are committed to transforming the social norms that allow violence against women and girls to continue, including through the new Pacific Partnership to End Violence Against Women and Girls program, which we heard about earlier from the director. The multi-million euro partnership is primarily funded by the European Union, with targeted support from the Australian government and UN Women, with UN Women also acting as coordinator for the program. And this webinar itself, of course, as earlier mentioned, is jointly coordinated by the Pacific Community, the Pacific Islands Forum Secretariat, and the UN Women Fiji Multi-Country Office. I think what's particularly exceptional about the Pacific Partnership is that it's this collective effort where international development partners, intergovernmental agencies, and civil society are united to end violence against women and girls. Because of the depth and the complexity of the problem, not only in our region but elsewhere, of course, it's clear that no one agency and not any one approach will find a solution. But together and working across all levels and sectors, there is hope. Now, someone who understands the need for strength and resilience in the face of this serious issue for the region is Shamima Ali. GBV rates, gender-based violence rates in the Pacific, they range from between 40 to 68% in terms of adult women having ever experienced it in their lifetime. Now, why is violence against women and girls so deeply entrenched in our region?
First of all, good morning, Nisambula Vinaka, bonjour to all our listeners in Brussels. Thank you very much, Tara, for that question. As I think it's quite well known, we all live in patriarchal societies, and the Pacific is no exception. Within that patriarchal society in Fiji, we have deeply entrenched views and attitudes about men and about women. And they're quite separate, the roles, the expectations that are allocated to each one of them. We call this and of course that's further exacerbated by, and of course underpinned by religious and cultural beliefs, sometimes, a lot of times assumed, that worsens the situation. So we call this the three stages in people's lives in the Pacific as well anywhere else. The first is the socialization, the genderization we call it, where girls are, are told how to behave, how to be, what their role is in the kitchen, and in the end to get married, where men are told their privileges are all theirs, the whole world is out there, you can go and get it. So that creates an environment of unequal privileges, unequal power relations, and also with the belief that men have a right to do this to women, and no one should interfere. It's a very private matter. So within that, and underpinning all of this is a lack of understanding of universal human rights, and particularly the human rights of women and girls.
I mean, you've described for us, Shamima, how it is that these harmful social norms get so deeply entrenched. Given they are so grounded in our culture, in our tradition, how can these be shifted? What's being done?
I think, we believe that we need to change that whole belief system and the attitudes, men's behavior, and there are many, many ways in which we can do that, and a lot of work is already being done in the Pacific to do that, to shift that mindset. But it also requires all of us to come to the table. As you said, the development partners, the intergovernmental agencies, the governments, the civil society organizations, the women's movement, the feminist women's movement. We need to all come together on this and make a concerted effort to end violence against women and girls. And a lot of that, I'm glad to say, is happening already.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Shamima. It's really clear that there is a long history of work in this area, and this is really just the latest collective but big effort on this front. Now we're going to hear about harmful social norms from a bit of a different perspective. Chope Tarai, who's an academic based here in Fiji, has been speaking publicly about the need to change our thinking and transform the social norms that means violence is accepted as normal in our homes. Chope is a teaching assistant in ethics and governance at the University of the South Pacific. And as a Fijian man, Chope is here to give a deeply personal insight into the violence that may be found in households across our region. Welcome, Chope.
Yeah, I think my reflection is based off, and probably it will help clarify the position of which I'm looking at these things through the TEDx video that I had done, and I was a part of TEDx in 2016, and I'm very fortunate to be a part of that in Fiji. And the whole idea of what I tried to introduce there was rethinking the Fijian man, and what you're talking about is unpacking masculinities. I didn't really think about it that way, but I suppose that's what it was. Part of that came from a personal position, because I had grown up in a domestically violent home, and I saw firsthand how social norms is a very powerful aspect. And ultimately, I'm a product of a conservative background on both sides of my father and my mother, like most people in Fiji and most people in the Pacific. And I realized that religion and culture are very powerful in shaping how gender roles are ultimately cultivated. So specific aspects about gender roles derived and fortified by culture and religion. So for instance, for boys, more often than not for Fijians, indigenous Fijians will be told things like, in indigenous Fijian, you're gonna tangani, you're gonna rakabongo, you're gonna lewango, nanomungo, which in English means you're a boy, you'll do this, you'll have authority over this, you have a certain level of power over this. For girls, and even now my sisters and cousins get told these things, which creates a lot of contention. Girls are told, you're gonna lewa, you're gonna varorongo, you're gonna sasamaki. So for girls, I mean, translated in English means you're a girl, you'll have to cook and clean, you'll have to listen. So inherently growing up, I realized that, and reflecting back now, that there's an inherent sense of subservience from one gender to the other. And religion and culture are so powerful in justifying certain aspects of that and its excesses. And unfortunately, I had to see those excesses and the abuse of that power and privilege when my mother had to be on the receiving end of that in terms of the violence that was expressed. So I realized how social norms are very powerful in that regard and how it influences a lot of how people conduct themselves and how really Fijians and Pacific Islanders tend to see the world through these particular pillars.
I mean, Chope, I think we can all, as Pacific Islanders, really relate to the picture you're painting for us. Now, given that these norms are so deeply entrenched, so much a part of who we are, how can these be shifted?
Well, part of, that's the big question, and reflecting a lot on what has been talked about and what a lot of people have talked about and thought about, I usually base what I think based on how people responded, especially Fijians, to the TEDx video. And even to this day, random people come up to me and tell me what they think. And I realize there's two aspects which are still forming in my mind. The first part is contextualization. And the second part to me is it has to do with men, but really the language of religion, which I think, of course, Reverend Loma Loma will explain further. But I realize in terms of contextualization, especially from Fijians and Pacific Islanders, when they look at the video, there's a sense that human rights is foreign, that it is something that is imposed on us and that our culture is under threat from that. And I found it very fascinating because there's a sense of resistance to it. So when I thought that something would be useful in terms of social norms or changing that, is contextualizing and meeting the values that can reflect human rights and connect it with cultural values. So the typical example that helps me understand this is, our rugby sevens team. When we won the Olympic gold medal in Rio, and an Englishman coached our team, and in the field he's often heard saying, Vilomani, which means in English, love one another, which technically translates to, listen to one another, share the ball, and be mindful of each other. There are other cultural values like Viromrongodi, which means to listen to one another. And I'm of the belief that these values themselves can be utilized to reconcile and contextualize human rights language so that people don't perceive it as imperial or as an imposition from the outside, in order for it to saturate certain aspects that can convince people that it is important to recognize these social norms and to change it. And just expanding on that, rugby in itself has galvanized a sense of unity around things and compelled people. And the second part of the language of religion, in Fiji and in the Pacific, religion is so powerful. People do so many interesting things with the language of religion. And so I am convinced there's something there about bridging these two worlds of human rights and culture and religion that ultimately can convince people, and men are central to that because of that position of privilege that can allow them to help encourage mitigating the excesses of these particular rules. So that's what I'm still thinking about, and I thought that would be useful in terms of changing the perceptions around social norms and how gender roles have been exploited.
Thanks, Chope. And given the huge influence of the church in our region, those working on the front lines of violence prevention are using now innovative faith-based approaches to transform these social norms. So one example is the work of Reverend Sarema Lomaloma of the Anglican Diocese of Polynesia. Reverend Sarema is coordinator of the House of Sarah that offers a Christian network of services for addressing violence against women and children. Welcome, Reverend Sarema.
Nakatar.
So tell us, and help situate things for our colleagues there in Brussels, how important is religion in the lives of Pacific Islanders?
Thank you, Tara. Thank you for that question, and good morning, everyone. Religion and the church, they're key. It's key. It's a very, very important part of the lives of people in the Pacific, in Fiji. And, we have to engage the church if we're going to be working towards transforming social norms and gender-based violence. And I'm speaking really from the Anglican Church and the Diocese of Polynesia, House of Sarah. The influence of the church is very, very strong. Considering that in all our villages here in Fiji, you are likely to have about 2 or 3 churches, denominations there. And then when you come to the urban areas, there are about 12 to 15 on average. And when you think about it, more than 50% of the people are Christians. Many of them grow up hearing the same teachings, the same beliefs. They're socialized into the same cultural values and religious interpretations, and they perpetuate the same, community norms, and both positive and negative. And some of these social norms and values, they've grown out of the understanding or interpretation of the Bible, such as if I want to quote some examples, women must be submissive to men. Man is the head of the household. Women and men are not equal. Only males are made in the image of God, and therefore they are superior. If a woman is submissive to her husband, there will be no family violence. I mean, these things we've grown up with. Chape has referred to it. He would have grown up with these values, and Shamima also. And I've grown up with these values. From many, many years, and we are still, these norms are still out there, they're still being practiced. And I give those examples really just to throw some light on why it's important to work with the church, to examine, the culture of the church, the theology and the practices, so that we can transform people's attitudes and behavior and prevent violence, gender-based violence.
So, Reverend Sarema, as you started saying towards the end there, what is the next step now that you have done the analysis of how maybe those norms are being perpetuated within our faith and culture? What can be done to make some transformation here?
4 things I think that I'd like to share with us, because in our work we've had to really go back to these things, and one is to really go back to the foundational level, which is looking at the biblical texts, because they give rise to these norms, really engaging the church as an institution so that we can look at the structures, the theology, the practices, engaging the whole community of faith, which means the ordained, the congregation, and then lastly, really looking at the community mobilization approach so that we can engage the whole community. And just to share with us, for the last few years, we've been holding workshops where we are looking into the biblical text again, and looking at it with a new lens, so that we hope that we will be able to change some of the thinking. Many people have grown up knowing only about Genesis 2, where it talks about the emphasis that the woman comes from the rib. They really may not go into Genesis 1, and and they are telling us then you are only a supporter because you come from the rib of the man. You're not really equal, to men. They quote Ephesians. It talks about women must be submissive to men. And so we are working in the church, and we're really looking at this biblical text. I've only quoted 2 there because we really need to go back to the basics, because these are the foundational issues here that really contribute to the development of those norms, and you really need to unpack those readings again and read them anew. Today, since we started the work, and I must acknowledge really the work of the Fiji Women's Christ Center that's been there for 30 years, 25, 30 years. 34. Yes, 34 years. We've been doing work in the community. The church has come on late, but thank God that we are there. And we started working in this area from 2013. Since we started this, looking into the biblical text, now you can hear sermons from the pulpit regarding, condemning violence against women, that it is a sin, that it is wrong. And we're also engaging men in the community, males in the community, so they are partners with us. We also look into reviewing the marriage preparation materials, because in the churches it's really the clergy who prepare couples for marriage, and the teachings that are there, we have to look at that anew so that we bring in issues of conflict and control and abuse and partnership. Many a times you'll hear stories about you, the woman, you cannot leave your home, your marriage, even though you are facing abuse, because to do that means you have broken the vow, when really it's a husband who has broken the vow in the first place. And so we're reading it anew. They're expected to stay and forgive, and so we're looking at this. Really, it is the husband who has broken the vow there. And also, I just want to link in with what Chope said about the terminologies. The finding the right terminology to use is very, very important. And it is right that a lot of people are really suspicious about human rights language. We go back and say, really, these are our birthrights. And Dr. Cliff Bird, one of our Pacific theologians, has really talked about this. When you look at this rights, it's actually really linked very closely to what is there in the Bible. So, instead of talking about human rights, these are your birthrights. And we try to come up with terminologies that bridges understanding instead of creating obstacles. There are other terminologies that we're using, like gender justice, restoring just and rightful relationships, affirming God's call to women and men, in leadership. Yes, and then also in the last 2 years, the church leaders have come out to speak publicly, against violence. So there's been work done in this area for a lot of years. And this year, the new one that we're doing is really engaging the community in a community mobilization approach, using a complete community mobilization approach. And this is the work that we are doing, and then that is being jointly supported by the Fiji Women's Fund and the UN Women through the Pacific Partnership Program. And we thank these two partners for joining us in this work.
Well, there's thank you very much for that, Reverend Sarema. There's clearly some very exciting work underway in the faith space around trying to address and really shift these norms that we have just come to accept as our normal way of life. But still so much more work to be done, of course. Thank you for that. Now let's cross over to Kiribati. It's a small island state which governs a huge area of ocean and also has the region's highest rates of violence against women. In Kiribati, 68% of ever-partnered women have experienced violence in their lifetime. It's a big challenge, but Kiribati is making significant progress with a project that focuses on addressing the power imbalance between men and women to transform social norms and hopefully to prevent violence. As our panel had said earlier, addressing gender-based violence requires our efforts across all sectors and all levels, and especially requires the commitment of our Pacific governments. And so we welcome to the discussion Anne Kausu, the Principal Women's Development Officer with the Women's Development Division of the Ministry of Women, Youth and Social Affairs in Kiribati. We had spoken with Anne earlier about the Strengthening Peaceful Villages project, through which communities are leading their own work to transform harmful social norms as a first step to the long-term goal of preventing violence against women and girls. Now, before the video plays, I just wanted to say to please excuse the sound interference in the footage. We're of course really grateful to the government of Kiribati for providing this video.
Well, SPV, or the Strengthening Peaceful Villages project, is a 4-year project which we have been fortunate to run within our ministry in Kiribati. It is a 4-year project targeting primary prevention of domestic violence, that is, ending violence from within the homes and communities. The survey showed that 68% of women from within the ages of 15 to 49, 68% that had experienced some sort of violence, whether physical, sexual, or both. This rate is seen as quite high, so our government saw the need to take a holistic approach to address the issue. In the past, we've had a lot of initiatives that are more secondary prevention approaches. So we decided to take up this SPV project as a primary prevention to implement in Kiribati. Some of the advantages that we've seen with this project is that it deals with difficulties in addressing culture in a positive manner. It also works directly in the communities and the homes where violence happens. With this project, we also appreciate that it has a research component where it monitors the success and failures of the project. It also enables us to make changes on the approaches when necessary. The availability of the UN Women Technical Assistance and the presence through the local staff or country staff has been a great advantage. Well, one of the biggest challenges, like many other countries, is culture. This has caused a lot of gender inequalities within our society. An effective behavioral change program is needed to address this issue. And although we have implemented a few initiatives to address this issue, many have not really focused on primary prevention. This SPV program is really focused on primary prevention. The second challenge is the dispersed nature of our islands, that make it very costly and difficult to keep the population in outer islands abreast of developments. Needed here is an effective communications program and a lot of resources. Therefore, in order to reach the people and leave no one behind, even though we have focal points on the outer islands, we still need better communications and more resources. Lastly, survivors of violence need more empowerment. They need an empowerment program to prevent them going back to further violence. Would like to take this opportunity to thank UN Women and all key partners of the Evo Pacific Partnership Program, especially the EU, DFAT, and UN Women. The government would also like to acknowledge the support of our prop agencies such as the Pacific Island Forum and the Pacific Community, RRRT. Would also like to wish all our sisters and brothers around the world Kiribati's blessings of good health, peace and prosperity, and the very best of luck in all our endeavors to end violence against women and girls. Kamdaba, thank you.
And thank you also to Anne Kausu, who we just heard sharing her experiences of the Strengthening Peaceful Villages project in Kiribati. And as we can see, it's really critical that government takes a strong role in national and provincial approaches to ending gender-based violence. The existing project that Anne just spoke about is continuing and will soon also be supported under the Pacific Partnership to End Violence Against Women and Girls. Now we're shortly going to break for questions with you in Brussels, but before we do, I'd just like to come back to the group here in the room for a moment and ask you, Shamima, could you tell us a little bit more, building on what Anne has just said, could you tell us a little bit more about some specific approaches and innovations that you feel are really making headway in transforming these harmful social norms?
Yes, this is when I get really excited because, 34 years of work, there's a lot of work that is going on. A lot of it is quite innovative work and aligned to international best practice. And I just want to start off with saying that the Pacific Women's Network Against Violence Against Women was established in 1992 with the first ever violence against women meeting in the Pacific. And that network is still going strong. It's a loose network of women's organizations and now more and more government organizations are joining that, individuals and so on, who have an interest in this work. And that network involves about 13 countries around the region. So it also involves us offering training on gender, violence against women and human rights, and it's quite popular around the region. Also mentoring of organizations, setting up a regional training institute on gender, violence against women and human rights in Fiji for the region. There's also the programming that is in most of the countries, and especially in Tonga, Vanuatu, and Fiji, is quite a unique integrated approach to ending violence against women, and very, very much human rights based, and recognizing violence against women as a developmental issue and as a human rights issue. There's been very strong lobbying and advocacy over the years around the Pacific, and that has resulted in a change of policy. It's very slow coming, but it is happening. So we're not just sitting around and talking about the problem. There's a whole lot of stuff working in policies and so on, and other people, everyone coming onto the agenda of ending violence against women, coming to the table. And the Male Advocacy for Women's Human Rights program that we developed here is quite unique. It's about men taking responsibility for their own violence and for other men's violence, accountability to the women's movement, the feminist women's movement, and there are many male advocates. This work has been done in Papua New Guinea, in Vanuatu, in Fiji, in Tonga, in the Cook Islands, and Solomon Islands is the next one. So, and it's quite a we believe it's shown a lot of results where, where they learn, they listen to the women, they learn about masculinities and so on. And we target men, particularly who are police officers. They're very important in this work. Traditional leaders, priests, policy makers, youth leaders, community leaders, and so on. We also have in Vanuatu the Committees Against Violence Against Women. So we are, many island nations. So we can't be everywhere. So Vanuatu has got this unique program of developing community committees where both male advocates and women taking the lead in all this. All our programs are based on women's experiences of violence, and that is one of the most, I think, proven effective ways of working in this area. The Tonga Women and Children's Crisis Center has got the one-stop crisis service where the lawyer, the nurse, the police officer, and the counselor advocates are all present in the one place. And in Fiji, coming back to Fiji, we also recently have started engaging with government, partnerships with government on male advocacy for the military, for the police, for the civil service. And very recently, we have done, last week actually, for the first time, a 2-day workshop with members of parliament. And that actually is quite a big thing that has happened, and that also is to create a bipartisan approach to ending violence against women. And so a whole lot of work that is going around the Pacific, huge challenges that come with it, working within the patriarchal system, trying to change attitudes, beliefs, and so on. And of course, we have the challenges around changing those entrenched attitudes, getting everyone on the same page. It's happening slowly, regional police training at executive level as well as at the frontline level and so on. And also, challenges where we're working with partners and, asking them to respect and recognize the work that is already being done and coming to the table to actually work out ways in which we can all be part of this great movement and a very essential issue and sort of almost an issue that is so entrenched. There is so, as you said, high levels of violence against women throughout the Pacific. It's about women's lives. It's about saving lives of women and girls. So I think that respect within partnerships and so on that we need to work on and bring to the table.
Yeah. I think a couple of things really stuck out to me from that. And that is that despite the heavily entrenched harmful social norms, the high levels of violence, we have seen some pockets of change. And, you spoke about the work with parliamentarians, which is really new for us here in Fiji, new for the region. Maybe, Reverend Sarema, I might throw it to you just to ask you, in your lifetime, in terms of your work in this area, what's one major change for the better that you've seen in terms of these harmful social norms? If we had to ask you, and I know I'm just throwing you on the spot here, if you had to think of what's one thing that really comes to mind when you think of a positive shift that's happened?
Well, even like the clergy themselves, speaking out against violence, that was not done long time ago.
Unheard
And
of, huh?
we've had to lay the foundation for that to be happening now. Many years ago, as far back as 2003, 2004, when we started sending them to attend the courses that Shamima used to run. I mean, that's still running.
Yeah.
So from that time, 2003, 2004, we are
this
seeing
is
the fruits of it now.
The like regional training program
Yes,
you're talking about.
That
Okay.
we're seeing, that they're actually preaching about it.
Yeah.
Is one thing. But that, that the women themselves in the communities are coming out and saying, this is not on. We are not going to accept this anymore. It is a husband who has broken the vow. If I feel like leaving my home, I'm not going to feel guilty about it. Yes. Which was before, it was really heavily,
That was
yes, that you have to forgive, you have to forgive, you have to forgive. At least, they don't, they don't feel blamed.
From when you were a child to being an adult now, what's the biggest shift you've seen?
I think mine is more of experience. I mean, just talking about this, I realize how things have changed. As a child in the 90s, I mean, my parents' incident, so to speak, would typically take place over Friday night, Saturday morning, or Saturday night, Sunday morning. And at the time, the first time I got to hear of the word reconcile was when we'd be shipped off to Vallevo police station.
Right.
And so growing up, I started to have a warped idea of what reconciling means. And I realized they would talk my mother down, or the police officers at the time, would talk my mother down and say, it's he's only drunk in indigenous Fijian while he's in, sleeping. And now, and that was in the 90s, I was a child and, just sitting there listening, going through it, and to a point where I used to joke about this with my cousins. It's almost like a field trip again. You almost get excited, not knowing, the extent of what was happening. Yeah. But now I realize how things have changed with police officers. They're very serious now. And a friend of mine who had an incident was saying like, oh, the police officers are very serious now, but they were telling off that guy and he could lose this. And I realized that in itself is a very strong relevance of the work of the women's movement, of these programs.
Why we're getting some nods.
So it's and when I'm hearing all of that, I was reflecting on how I joke about it with my cousins. Oh man, it's a different time in the 90s, and we were just kids then, and now it's really serious, and people get threatened. I mean, not threatened, but sort of taking it seriously as a guy. What you're doing is wrong. And police officers are also very serious about it, as opposed to before. He'll just have to slip it off. He's just drunk.
Just understand.
Even though it's like the umpteenth time that we're there again. So I think there's a lot of change in that regard in terms of the advocacy, the policy work, which is amazing.
It's probably a lovely point for us to jump off and send it back to Brussels to see if perhaps you, Mary, and the group have some questions here for us in Suva. Over to you, Mary. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Marina. I work in the Commission. Thank you very much for your interventions, because they are extremely interesting, very new perspective from this side of the world. Which is the role of the formal education in this transformative approach?
That interesting question from Marina. We talked about cultural norms, we talked about human rights, but what about the role of formal education?
I'm here really representing the Diocese of Polynesia Anglican Church. We have 10 schools, and so the curriculum that we produce Christian education curriculum, but in there that we began to introduce equal and respectful relationships in a really simple way, so that because the resources are taught from year 1 to year 8, and there's so much bullying going on in the schools, and then we have to find the right language, to address this, and that's why we began to build into our Christian education curriculum about having equal and respectful relationships.
And that's starting from what age? What age is that
year
for?
1, which is about they are 6 years old, to year 8.
Maybe about 12, 13.
Yes, 12, 13.
Yeah.
So that's what I can share with you.
Okay.
That's what we're doing for our schools.
Thank you, Reverend. Shamima Ochope, did you have anything to add on that one?
Yes, I totally agree with you, Marina, but it is quite difficult to get into schools, particularly, governments are quite reluctant for human rights to be taught in schools. So there is a program called the Family Life, and that also is optional. We have been trying very hard, so sometimes people are, there's not it's not part of the curriculum, but we are trying to advocate for that, and there is engagement now between government and civil society and other stakeholders, so that there is an opening there where we can, and it is being talked about, but we just haven't been able to do that.
Yes, hello, I'm Matthias Reusing. I'm also with the Commission and I've been involved in the Sciences program. I have two questions linked to cultural norms, traditions and religion. In the testimony we saw from Tonga, I found it interesting to start with the religion, that the priest came to the families, they were praying and then he left and the thing continued. So first question on the religion is how openly do priests speak in church also about it? Is it praying and isn't talking about love, or do they really address the issue that there's something wrong and they publicly address it also, not only at home, because I believe this could be important. And the second question would be on the other, also from the same testimony, that the elderly in the family told the girl or the wife, go home to your husband, you have to be a good wife, you have to be nice, and I think that's a very important target group, the mothers and the grandmothers.
Yeah, how openly are priests speaking within the church from the pulpit, as it were, against violence against women? So I think you mentioned some of that earlier, but in Offa's example, she spoke about how the priest basically didn't speak out in a public fora to call out that violence.
Yes, so I mean, I'm talking really about Fiji and really the Anglican Church,
Okay.
where we've been working in this area for a number of years. And so where the church itself has made a commitment and has spoken out against it and has actually got a policy. So because of that, the clergy persons who have undergone training, they're able to speak out they're able to preach about it.
Where the women's movements are stronger, that is where you have a lot more people speaking out against, including the churches and so on. But we still have to contend with sometimes, because people go to their priests or priest wives and so on, where women's groups have said with a woman who's been raped to say, let us pray to get the devil out of you because you got raped. So there's still, you hear that, the devil is in you, therefore this is happening to you. Still hear that. But overall, there have been a lot of changes where priests are, and particularly during Mother's Day, International Women's Day, things are changing in quite a few of the churches where they are talking about stopping violence against women and so on.
Okay. Did you want to add anything to that before we go? Okay, well, I might come to you in a moment, Chope. But before I do, just the next question, which was around kind of the role, particularly of older women, elders in the community, including mothers and grandmothers, in perpetuating some of the social norms around this. The go back to your husband, darling, sort of, that is said to daughters in these situations. What work is being done with other women in the community?
There is a change. So we have to ask the question: why is it that the older women are saying that? Because it's also, while we have these rules that are made within patriarchy by men mostly, and so on, it's the women who police it. Right. So they are policing, so they make sure that the women go back, because reconciliation is something that people really push here. They don't want families to break up, but we're telling them address the issues that break up families. So often the woman is blamed for breaking it up and so on. So older women put a lot of pressure on women. Look, we went through it all and we're happy now. So therefore, you need to, all women go through this. But what is good around the Pacific, we are having increased rates of reporting
Okay.
of domestic
Okay.
violence. That is
Yeah.
something throughout the
Yeah.
Pacific because of the awareness, the women's movement, and so on, which is a good thing. But still, reconciliation. And also these things are institutionalized. So, the police also feel, even though we've got excellent laws and so on, while overall policing has really improved around violence against women, there's still a huge challenge there where the police also believe that we need to keep the families together. So reconciliation again is there also. So they feel the first duty is to reconcile.
Yeah.
I'm a bit confused because I think some social norms about gender roles are actually common across cultures. So the patriarchal culture is common to different cultures. So we have to be careful about social norms, cultural norms, religious. So you mentioned that some religious norms and beliefs can be used to the advantage of challenging social norms, but yet they come from interpretation of religion, which is mainly patriarchal. Can you give some more example of what cultural norms, like in terms of traditional culture, can be used to the advantage of challenging social norms about gender and not to the detriment of the same? Thank you.
Chope, you were talking about positive cultural norms that can be harnessed, and you shared 2 examples with us. The question was, are there any other examples, or maybe go deeper into those for us?
I think it's very interesting, the fourth question, because that's a lot of the similar sentiment that I received after the TEDx video. When I talked about rethinking the Fijian man, there were a lot of people who would privately see me and question me. First thing is question my identity, whether I'm still Fijian or not, because of some of the things that I had talked about. And I realized that there's a fear about cultural values, like the question alluded to, and cultural norms. I think another example, and I relate this to my late grandfather. My late grandfather, on his deathbed, he mentioned to me how my mother was his Mona Lisa. And he emphasized how when my father's family came, Posaki, Tungudi, to ask for her hand in marriage, there's a cultural set of values and protocols there that emphasizes the duty of care and love that is expressed. So my grandfather grew up during the colonial period, and he always said when he read of the Mona Lisa, he wanted to know what's the big deal about this painting. And on his deathbed, the last time we had a proper conversation, when he was still himself, before he slowly fell apart, he said, your mother was my Mona Lisa. I never got to see the Mona Lisa, wherever it was in Europe. But unfortunately, your father didn't protect my Mona Lisa. And I realized he mentioned that in the sense that Mona Lisa was protected by different times and monarchies and powerful people. And he kept on emphasizing that process, that protocol of when they came to ask for permission to have my mother's hand in marriage. He said, it was the only time I cried. And so these cultural values that protects that dignity and the duty of care, that unfortunately there are certain elements of it, which I think can be resituated to emphasize a certain sense of responsibility that we need to have. And I notice my grandfather was at times would never be the one to say, go back to your husband.
Yeah.
He was always sort of, okay, you guys are going to stay here for a while. And so there are certain aspects of it that I think that doesn't mean that culture and religion is bad. There are certain bits of it that needs to be re-emphasized and then I think localized to remind Fijians, just like rugby, for instance. Rugby is an introduced sport, but we've made it our own in the offload game that everybody has accepted it. And I feel like that's can be a similar story for human rights, that we can localize it and contextualize it, that we can make it our own and reconfigure these particular aspects to make people see that there are certain things in it that we can change for the better without having to demolish cultural structures and social structures and all these things.
Also, when culture, it has changed so much. It's not cast in stone, so it keeps changing and so on, things like that. So everything else is acceptable, but when it comes to changing male-female relationships, the power relationships between men and women, about talking about women's work, male privileges, and so on, then immediately people shut others down who are talking about this using culture and religion, all the time. Whereas if you really look at throughout the Pacific, the culture, the pre-colonial cultures and so on. There's this huge, there's a lot of equality. There was a huge protection for women in terms of relatives. If a man dare not beat up a woman because the brothers will descend upon you and so on, and that went on for quite. There were traditional mechanisms that prevented violence and so on. People who raped were clubbed to death, never mind what the compensation was, how many pigs you brought, how much taro you brought, how many mets. And in a lot of Pacific Islands, that is still, that used to be the case. But now that compensation is used to excuse the rapists and excuse the crime, so that misuse. So when we are teaching throughout the Pacific Network, we are reminding people of ancient cultures, ethnic cultures, and so on.
Yeah, it's really about kind of building our knowledge on those forms, which you were asking about. So thank you, Suva panel. On that note, we'll give it back to Mary to see if there's any other questions from Brussels.
So yeah, one last question and then we need to wrap up.
Hi, my name is Rebecca von Schrieb. I work for the DigiDevCo for the Pacific section. What do you think about for example, in Fiji, the government's ways of addressing these social norms that we've been talking about and achieving change? What do you think, for example, that there are strong enough gender policies and also the work of the Ministry of Women? And is there enough cross-cutting work into the different ministries overall?
First of all, I would like to answer how we are engaging and what kind of work is being done. The Fiji government actually has a national gender policy. We have just launched, in partnership with UN Women and the Ministry for Women, the service delivery protocol, which is a big achievement, and we have an elimination of violence against women task force made up of government and non-governmental organizations and UN agencies and other intergovernmental agencies. And out of this, a lot of work is being done in terms of raising awareness, developing policy, also the zero tolerance legislation, the zero tolerance communities, that is the development with the Ministry for Women, which is up for review now, where they're going out into the communities and trying to, get people onto prevention work and creating communities that are violence-free and so on. So there's a whole lot of work that is being done, but it doesn't mean the conversation has ended. From the EVO task force, there is a voice coming out, and people are, and including the Minister for Women, who's very progressive around this, and whereby we are negotiating to develop material for schools about gender equality, about human rights, about respectful relationships, and so on, how to do it, working with UN Women, and so on. That is still a work in progress.
Okay, great. Thank you, Shamima. I'm aware we're running out of time, so I might send it back to Mary to just check in. Yeah, if we've got enough time for a last question, or is it time to say goodbye?
Yeah, it's time to say goodbye now because there's other sessions coming after. So if you want to say your last word of today's panel.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Mary. Thank you to the panel. I might just throw you back if there's any one last short point you would like to make to our colleagues in Brussels. Feel free. Otherwise, maybe we'll just wish them adieu. Do you say au revoir? For us, we say more.
Yes. I'm really looking forward to this new partnership.
Yeah.
And looking forward to working with you.
Yes, indeed. I echo that. And we thank the UN Women and European Union, for the Pacific Partnership. We are one of the grantees, so thank you.
Wonderful. Chope?
I'm just glad to be here and be part of the conversation.
Thank you. Yes, we're on a journey here. It's been a long one. The road is a long one, but it looks like we're at a moment of real positivity and real momentum for change. So thank you very much to Brussels for listening in, and it's been great talking with you. Goodbye from Suva.
For more details about the Pacific Partnership to End Violence Against Women and Girls, or to connect with our speakers,